Hello, everybody. So we've been talking about history the last few weeks. We looked at the history of just cannabis consumption in general, and then, of course, explored the history of its criminalization and kind of what the Prohibition era looks like. And now want to go into talking about, essentially what we call the legalization era, and I say, the legalization area, at least for some, because of course cannabis is not legal for everybody. In fact, in the United States, we still have only a handful of states where it's legal for adult use, many more for medical consumption. And around the world, we have a hodgepodge. So while we talk about the legalization era, we definitely want to acknowledge that cannabis prohibitionist policies are still in effect in many areas, and cannabis is most definitely not legal for everyone. But again, we do really talk about entering a different era and just kind of want to go over some highlights of that era and kind of how we got to it. Is again with a lot of the other topics, I think understanding the history gives some nice insight. So I have three dates on here. If we were in class, I'd ask you what you think they mean, but you can pause and see if you have an insight as we're talking about legalization, what these three dates mean, but really kind of go through them. 1973 is actually interesting. It's actually the first time there was a decriminalization law in the United States, and this occurred in Texas of all places. In 1973, they reduced less than 4 ounces of cannabis from a felony to a misdemeanor. A little odd that maybe Texas was a leader in decriminalization. Certainly, they're kind of at the back of our kind of more progressive cannabis policies these days. But in fact, that was one of the early decriminalization laws that got passed. And really, over the next decade, throughout the 70s, we see a variety of states, about 13 of them, passing various levels of decriminalization of cannabis. 1996 is really quite prominent. That's the first time we had a state legalize some form of cannabis consumption and sale for that matter. So this was California, Prop 215 in 1996. They became the first state to legalize medical cannabis. This was fairly kind of monumentary at the time, and we'll touch on in a little bit some of the steps that led to that. Since 1996, really a slew of states followed with various medical legalization laws, and every state had a completely different set of rules, regulations, and industry models, which has added to some of the confusion in the United States in this era of legalization. Colorado technically legalized medical cannabis in 2000, though really the full-scale classic dispensary model didn't begin until right around 2010. And as I said earlier, our first week of class, that's kind of when I started working with patients regarding medical cannabis consumption, really started learning more kind of about this topic beyond just what was my personal knowledge. 2012, I suspect many of you might know, but that's when Colorado and Washington first voted to legalize adult consumption of cannabis. Of course, dispensaries opened a little bit later, January 1st, 2014. And of course, that set the stage now for the last decade. We've had a growth of states legalizing adult use cannabis consumption throughout the United States. 2013 is actually the first time a country legalized cannabis, and that was Uruguay. And excuse the pronunciation if that's wrong. So in 2013, Uruguay approved legal adult use cannabis. That was followed by Canada in 2018. Again, they also have different models. But these are just some of the dates that are important on this path to legalization that we've been on really over the past 27 years-ish or so, with the legalization of medical cannabis in California. So kind of where are we at today? This is a map of the United States that was updated in June. We know change at the federal level is inevitable, but still really nobody knows the timing, even with the Department of Health and Human Services recommending cannabis be rescheduled. They made that recommendation last week, as we talked about. Who knows when that gets acted on? But at some point, there'll be federal change. But right now in the US, we're still on this hodgepodge of different states doing different things. And in reality, 47 states have some kind of medical cannabis program. Though, as you could see in the kind of more brighter orange, a lot of those states are really just some form of hemp access, very low THC, they're less than 1% or less than 0.3%. There's still 3 states that really don't have anything on the books at this point: Kansas, Nebraska, and Idaho. And so whether those states do anything before the feds do something kind of remains to be seen. But you can see in the green, there's quite a bit in the West where adult use cannabis is legal, and then through the Midwest and the Northeast. Of course, the South still has some of the more restrictive policies in the United States. Internationally, as I mentioned, Uruguay legalized in 2013, Canada in 2018. Since then, Malta, Thailand, and Luxembourg have passed some form of adult use legalization. But we still have this hodgepodge internationally where some countries have very progressive national policies regarding cannabis consumption, while on the flip side, there's other countries that have serious and severe draconian penalties for cannabis possession. But following medical legalization in California, there's been almost 50 countries that have decriminalized cannabis for some level. And there's certainly a growth in medical cannabis programs and medical legalization, certainly the most well-known of those being in Israel, which is really considered the leader in medical cannabis. Mentioned Uruguay and Canada, again, followed by Malta, Thailand, and Luxembourg. And on the international scale, descheduling or rescheduling came sooner. In 2020, the United Nations rescheduled cannabis from their Schedule 4, which is their most restrictive category, similar to our Schedule 1, and they rescheduled cannabis to the United Nations Schedule 1, which was probably more similar to our Schedule 3 or 4. So a little bit confusing. We have the numbers flipped with the United Nations. But nonetheless, the world is starting to become more progressive with their cannabis policies. So we've had this massive change, not just in cannabis legalization, but cannabis opinion in the US over the past 30 years. So this is a timeline of Gallup surveys for cannabis, whether United States citizens support legalization of cannabis. And they simply asked, do you think the use of marijuana should be legal or not? And the last couple of years, it's held stable. As recently as 2022, 68% of Americans say yes, cannabis should be legal. And again, you can see it's a massive change over the last 30 to 50 years. Really, numbers held steady in the teens to 20s up until California passed their first medical cannabis legalization bill. And we've seen just significant growth in terms of United States citizens who support cannabis legalization. And really, this approval, so to speak, is larger than just about any issue or institutions for which Americans are regularly surveyed. So more Americans support cannabis legalization than they do any presidential figure, presidential candidate, certainly the approval of Congress, confidence in police or religion or the medical system or public schools, banks, labor, you name it. There's uh, widespread support for cannabis across all ages, races, political parties. There are certainly differences amongst those demographics. The support for cannabis is larger amongst more progressive and democratic ideologies. But that being said, even still, a majority of conservatives still believe cannabis should be legal. And when it comes to medical cannabis, it's even higher. An overwhelming share of adults, generally about 90%, say that cannabis should be legal for medicinal use. So that really leaves really just 1 in 10 or 10% of Americans that don't believe cannabis should be legal for any reason. So kind of what happened? How did we get this massive change? It wasn't clearly the government leading the way saying, oh, we need to make cannabis legal and then convincing the public that we should do so. This was really a variety of interplay between public policy change or public opinion changed, excuse me, which then led to public policy changing. And there's just this variety of cultural factors and events that really helped change the public mindset. And there were many, but I kind of want to highlight three of them, which I just kind of say activists, patients, and the media. And so cannabis obviously has been underground since the 30s and really deep underground when the war on drugs kind of became prominent in the 1970s. But obviously, there were individuals who felt cannabis was valuable to themselves and valuable to others. And so I just kind of want to highlight, kind of the role of some advocates, because especially for younger individuals who kind of are born into today's world, all they know is to get cannabis. You go to the store and you get cannabis when you're of legal age, or if you're a medical patient. Maybe don't fully appreciate kind of the work that went in to kind of reach this step. So there was huge efforts by advocates. I just highlighted a couple here. There are many more. On the right is Dennis Perron in this picture. He learned about cannabis in Vietnam, where he consumed it to deal with a range of personal and traumas he was exposed to. When he returned to San Francisco, he became a longtime advocate for cannabis rights and really alongside rights for the LGBTQ community. On the left is her name is Mary Jane Rathbun, but she's more commonly known as Brownie Mary. A very interesting story. It was a single heterosexual woman who lived in a predominantly gay and lesbian district in San Francisco, and she didn't have a family, so kind of her community became part of her family, and she was, of course, living in San Francisco when the AIDS epidemic hit in the 80s and into the 90s, and she was known for her pot brownies, and she and others were noticing how much benefit those with HIV were having with these brownies, for the wasting, the weight loss that occurred, and the nausea and the pain and the mental health issues that were occurring with their disease. She also saw it was helping other folks benefit with cannabis, and she was a volunteer at San Francisco General Hospital, similar to our Denver Health, and she was even named Hospital Volunteer of the Year in 1986, despite being arrested multiple times for cannabis possession. And so there are advocates like this that just never gave up the fight. I made a required resource in this week's readings that just kind of describes a little bit about California's passage of Prop 215 25 years later. So you'll see that in the resources. And again, these were people that got arrested, risked their freedom, their well-being, and really even sometimes their lives for this movement. And so these advocates were a huge part of how these legalization efforts went forward. And another big group were patients. Now, I mentioned even with some of the advocates, there's overlap with patients and advocates because often patients who saw the value of cannabis for themselves or their loved ones, um, and then realized how illegal it was, became advocates for trying to make this accessible to so many other people. But again, initially, there wasn't much knowledge of patients who were benefiting from cannabis. There was a couple interesting stories in the 70s, including one gentleman for his glaucoma who actually petitioned to get government supplied cannabis successfully, made some news briefly, but for the most part, um, information really kind of first took off again in the late 90s and early 2000s after California's passage and the AIDS epidemic was going on, and we started seeing value there that I alluded to. And then we had a big shift really because of this young lady who I have shown in the pictures. Her name was Charlotte Figge. She had a rare seizure disorder. She was having 300 seizures a week, and had tried everything the medical system offered, and her family through some connections decided to use cannabis because they'd heard that there was potential value there, and cannabis was hugely beneficial for her. Seizures went from hundreds per week to just a handful a month, and her story got highlighted to the national, media in 2013 when Sanjay Gupta and CNN published their first weed documentary, and really the world got to know Charlotte Figge, and her story did, several things. I mean, first, it provided awareness, and hundreds of other families who had children dealing with refractory seizures started coming to Colorado primarily for access and for the ability to use cannabis for their children. So then stories started escalating as those patients had benefit. But then really just as things often are done through documentary and through mainstream media, kind of captured the heart of many individuals. And, this was one of the first times people started hearing stories about cannabis that, kind of weren't the negative propaganda of many years prior. And so, patients like her and then many patients that followed just started changing the mindset um, after 1996 and then the following decade, where kind of medical use became more common, and the stories of those patients who were having such wonderful benefits kind of became too hard to ignore and just infused through the national consciousness. And this alludes to the impact that media can have. Um, this is a slide from one of your resources that shows specifically the New York Times, but just shows how their coverage of cannabis changed throughout the 80s into the 20 teens. So you see, in blue and black on the graph throughout the 80s and into the mid 90s, really the overwhelming majority of the stories are all about drug trafficking and abuse and kind of linking cannabis with other drugs. Again, all the stuff in the propaganda we talked about last week, this fear propaganda. But then as we see again after 1996 and California's medical law passed, we see this shift where now the stories are talking about the potential medical benefit. We see the stories talking about kind of politics and policy, and a lot of that is the negative ramifications of the war on drugs and mass incarceration. And then again, we see that not just the tone of the coverage shift, but really the amount of coverage shift after 2010, where those stories become more common and kind of seeing those trends continue. So this is just an example from the New York Times, but again, this shift in how the media was talking about cannabis began to change dramatically. I mentioned the CNN special that highlighted Charlotte Figge's story, and things like that kind of just simply became more common. And so we're having this cultural impact of awareness and media awareness, and really dictating the conversation, or a change in the conversation, that then led to public support and passage of this wide range of cannabis legalization bills around the country. And so this is kind of bringing us forward to where we are now. First, there's just a growing awareness of that cannabis is part of people's lives, both for social reasons, recreational reasons, however you define that, and for medical reasons. As I mentioned, you know, most people will now know somebody who's used medical cannabis for some reason, or at least know somebody who knows somebody. Again, there's just this awareness. Historically, there was just a handful of celebrities who were open about their cannabis consumption, whereas that's just increased dramatically, where various celebrities, business people, even politicians now are comfortable acknowledging their consumption. As I mentioned, I think the first class myself, when I started working with patients in 2010 with cannabis, definitely did not mention any of my personal experience with it whatsoever. By 2017, 2018, I became a little more comfortable talking to individual patients about that. And by kind of 2019, 2020, 2021, that's kind of the first times I even mentioned publicly, whether it be a podcast or an interview or something like that, about my own, personal experiences with cannabis. Now, kind of in 2023, I don't really hide that at all. So again, there's just increased awareness, as people who are using cannabis feel kind of more comfortable, um, kind of letting that out there to others. And with that awareness comes acknowledgement within the community. This is a quote from our book. And so a quote from John Hudak, who says, quote, "People who experimented with marijuana, and an increasing share of the population was doing so, saw that they did not automatically become schizophrenic sexual predators intent on committing acts of murder, nor did they necessarily drop out of college and forgo a life of success, or inexorably become addicted to hard drugs. Their experience with the drug was far less harmful than government rhetoric and advertising had been warning for decades. The same experience dynamic applied as states began implementing medical cannabis regimens. The sky did not fall." So again, it just became this pattern where cannabis was more accepted, people were more aware of it. The more that they knew others using cannabis, they kind of saw that the stereotypes and the stigmas that they were taught to believe over the last many decades just weren't true, the majority of the time at least. Obviously, there's always situations where folks might fit a stereotype, but overwhelmingly, again, they saw that, wow, cannabis was a normal or potentially healthy part of many people's world. So there's kind of this now acknowledgement that what we were told wasn't necessarily always true. And ideally, we move into acceptance, or what people might call normalization. Normalization is where we just don't think of kind of someone's consumption of cannabis at all. It's not a yes or no. We think about it no different than what kind of car they drive, or what color their house is. It's just something about somebody, but it's kind of a non-issue. And I would say we're not quite at normalization yet. Again, there's a study I included in your resources both last week and this week that really beautifully describes stigmas surrounding cannabis use, and talking about have we reached normalization. And the data that they present in that study kind of shows no, we're not quite there. But we are at a point of growing acceptance. And so, cannabis access and legalization is a reality. certainly many people are moving on to different fights and policy issues, but there's still more, we need to do. And public perception and public opinion really aren't always the answer. So even though there's overwhelming uh, public opinion for the legalization of cannabis now, um, it's just 25 years ago that public opinion swayed the other direction. So we can't always necessarily rely on public opinion. And so the public will often support policies that are harmful to citizens. The other thing we have to acknowledge, we have quite a bit of pro-cannabis propaganda now coming that often kind of over accentuates potential benefits or might minimize potential risks. And this makes sense to some extent. Cannabis advocates have been pushed aside for so long that they often feel they just need to kind of voraciously advocate for the plant, really to counteract the propaganda of the last 100 years. Plus, there's the sense that any acknowledgement of potential harms kind of might be taken as an agreement that, again, that propaganda during the Prohibition era was accurate. But ideally, now that we've gotten into this legalization area, we want to look deeper, and we want to talk in an educated way about pros and cons. We want to identify what risks are developing, certainly how big of a concern are they, and how can we mitigate risks without obviously resulting or going back to the draconian policies of prohibition and mass incarceration. So that's kind of where we've come to historically, and how some of kind of social, and cultural events and views have kind of shaped our legalization era. That story is still probably very different, again, depending on where you live. If you grew up in Colorado in the last 20 years or California in the last 20 years, you have a very different view of cannabis than if you grew up in a still highly restrictive state with fairly severe penalties for cannabis consumption. So again, we are not at any universal agreement, but those are kind of the historical things I wanted to highlight as we think about how we've moved into this legalization era. All right, we'll talk to you guys soon.